I was just the invisible nurse, the pregnant girl everyone looked past. When I saw the powder slip into Dante Moretti's glass, I knew speaking up would sound crazy. Hormones, they'd say. But I couldn't let him die. That hasty note was my only weapon. I expected him to laugh or worse. Instead, he shattered the glass and dragged me into his world of fire and shadows. They called me a gold digger, a burden, a weakness. But Dante saw what they didn't. He saw the truth in my eyes when others saw only hysteria. He stood between me and the bullets, between my unborn child and the monsters. And when he knelt before me, swearing his loyalty not to a crown, but to us, I realized I wasn't just a nurse anymore. I was the queen of a king who would burn the world down just to keep us warm. And you know, as I'm telling you all of this, sometimes I still catch myself looking at my hands, remembering that moment when they were shaking so badly, I could barely hold the pen, thinking, how did I get here? It feels like a lifetime ago, a story that happened to someone else, but it's mine. It's all mine. And that's the honest truth of it. You're here with me now, listening to this journey, and that connection we share, it's everything. That initial moment of panic, that feeling of being completely alone against a tide of cynicism and danger, that's a universal feeling, isn't it? We've all been there, standing up for something when everyone else is telling us to sit down, to shut up, to know our place. I know you understand what I mean when I say that the fear wasn't about the poison itself, but about the overwhelming certainty that if I spoke, I would be dismissed, mocked, and maybe even punished for daring to intervene in adult business, as Ethan so condescendingly put it. But you can't live with yourself if you stand by while a murder happens, no matter who the victim is or how scary the consequence. So if you're listening on your phone right now, just pause for a second, open it up. And if this story is touching something deep inside you, something you've felt before, please just take a moment to hit that like button. Leave a comment below telling me one time you were completely underestimated, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps me share these stories, and honestly, every little interaction makes me feel like I'm not just talking into the void, that there are other people out there who understand what it means to be overlooked, to find strength when you didn't even know you had it, and to finally claim your own life, your own power, and your own voice. Thank you. The hospital air conditioning was always set too high, giving the hallway that sharp antiseptic chill that could never quite mask the metallic smell of blood and fear. And I remember feeling particularly cold that morning, probably because the weight of Lily, my baby, was making me move slower, making me feel heavier and more exposed, like a slow-moving target in a fast world. I was restocking the surgical supply closet, counting gauze rolls, a completely mundane task that kept me out of the way, which was exactly where I preferred to be when he walked by Dante Moretti. Even in the hushed, sterile environment of the hospital, he carried an atmosphere with him, a deep, silent kind of power that made the nurses stop whispering and the doctors straighten their backs. It wasn't just his reputation as the head of the Moretti family, the shadowy figure of the underworld. It was the way he moved, slow and deliberate, like a predator who knew he owned every room he stepped into, and the quiet intensity in his eyes, which seemed to be constantly assessing the threat level of everything around him, even a pregnant, invisible nurse like me. He was heading toward the private waiting area, and the usual entourage of dark suits trailed behind him. But what caught my eye wasn't the men or the expensive Italian shoes. It was the two shadows that separated from the wall, smooth as oil, moving toward the beverage station, where Dante's aide was about to pour him a drink. These guys were different from Dante's usual crew. They were too lean, too quiet, and they had that look in their eyes, that hard, flat indifference you only see in people who do dirty things for a living and don't feel a thing about it. And my stomach immediately twisted in a sharp knot of pure primal dread. They wore standard business suits, charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, but there was something about the way the fabric stretched across their shoulders. Too stiff, too ready to conceal a weapon that screamed professional killer, not financial consultant. They moved with the kind of calculated efficiency that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, the kind of stillness that meant they were only waiting for the perfect window of opportunity. I watched frozen as the aide turned his back for a split second to grab the lemon wedge, and that was all the time the two men needed. One of them, with a surprisingly delicate movement for such a large hand, flicked a minuscule amount of fine white powder into the glass before the aide returned, and the whole sequence was so fast, so practiced, that if I hadn't been standing there completely still and watching the scene unfold from the peripheral of my vision, I never would have noticed it at all. The man who did it didn't even glance at the glass. His eyes were fixed on the doorway, already planning their exit, completely assured of their success. My heart started slamming against my ribs, a loud, panicked drumbeat that I was sure everyone in the quiet hallway could hear. And the first thing I did was look around for help, for a security guard, for anyone with a badge and authority. But of course, no one was looking. They were all absorbed in their clipboards, their phones, or trying very hard not to look at Dante Moretti. And I realized in that sinking moment that I was utterly alone, the only witness and my word a nurse barely making rent, a woman 5 months pregnant with a child whose father was long gone, and whose identity was nobody's business, was worth absolutely nothing against the smooth, calculated moves of 2 killers. The feeling of helplessness was suffocating, bringing back that old, familiar wave of panic, the kind where you know you're about to be steamrolled, and no matter how loudly you scream, no one will listen. And that was when Dr. Ethan Blackwell, the chief doctor with the too perfect smile and the eyes that always seemed to hold a secret judgment, walked up to my station smelling faintly of expensive cologne and overconfidence. I remember clutching the edge of the metal cart so hard my knuckles turned white, my breath catching in my throat as I tried to form the words to tell Ethan what I'd just seen. But he just cut me off, not even bothering to look me in the eye as he adjusted his expensive silk tie. "Still counting gauze, Ava? A bit beneath your skill level, isn't it?" he asked, his tone dripping with patronizing disdain, as if I were a particularly dull piece of equipment. I hated how easily he could make me feel small, how he could dismiss my whole existence with a single careless sentence. When I finally stammered out, trying desperately to inject urgency into my voice, "There's something wrong with Mr. Moretti's drink. I saw them. They put something in it." Ethan actually laughed, a low, dismissive sound that was instantly recognizable as the sound of someone completely secure in his own self-importance, totally indifferent to the potential for actual danger. He leaned in, conspiratorially lowering his voice just enough, so only I could hear the cutting cruelty in his words, telling me to focus on my priorities. "Maybe it's your pregnancy hormones, Ava. You know, that lovely cocktail of emotions that makes everything look dramatic. Stress can do funny things to a young mind, dear. Focus on keeping your baby safe. Don't meddle in adult business." He finished, giving me a pitying look that was far worse than any open insult, a look that said, "You are hysterically insignificant." Then he simply walked away, leaving me standing there with the unspoken accusation hanging in the air. I was unstable, hormonal, and unimportant, a perfect example of a person whose reality could be dismissed with a single wave of the hand, and every second he wasted was a second closer to Dante's death. The clock was ticking not in minutes but in heartbeats, and I knew I couldn't stand there and wait for the poison to be consumed, couldn't wait for the man who was feared by everyone to simply drop dead because I was too scared or too dismissed to act. And in that moment, the shame and the panic coalesced into a sharp, cold determination. I wasn't just saving him. I was standing up for the truth that no one wanted to hear. The hospital provided cheap little prescription pads for nurses, thin paper with a perforated edge, and I ripped one off the magnetic board, snatching a pen, my hand still trembling uncontrollably, not from fear anymore but from adrenaline, and I quickly scribbled the only thought that mattered. "They poisoned your drink." I folded the tiny piece of paper twice, making it as small and unobtrusive as possible, small enough to feel like a fleeting piece of static, and I walked straight out of the supply closet, moving with a speed and focus that surprised even myself, pushing past the crowd of people who suddenly looked up, startled by the sight of the quiet, pregnant nurse moving with such intent. I saw Dante coming back from a phone call near the elevator bank, his face a mask of cold impatience, clearly irritated by the delay, and as he passed me in the narrow hallway, I didn't hesitate. I brushed against his arm, a violation of the unspoken rule that you don't touch Dante Moretti, and with a movement born of sheer terror and adrenaline, I slipped the note into the sleeve of his custom-tailored jacket, right near the cuff, where he was certain to feel the slight crinkle of the paper against his skin. He stopped not violently, but with a sudden complete stillness that felt heavier than any explosion, and I felt his eyes lock onto mine, a gaze so intense it felt like he was not just seeing me, but reading the entire timeline of my life, every mistake, every hidden fear, every honest moment of kindness, all in that one terrifying second. He didn't move his head, didn't check his sleeve, but I knew he knew I had given him something. I couldn't look away, couldn't even breathe. And the noise around us, the gentle beeping of machines, the rolling of gurneys, the endless hospital chatter all faded into a muffled roar, leaving only the two of us suspended in that tense, silent moment, that silent electric exchange of information. That's when the snickering started again, low and ugly, from the small cluster of staff and visitors nearby, who had noticed the strange interaction, their voices carrying the usual cruel judgment I was so used to hearing. "Oh, look at her. She's probably trying to get attention from the Mafia boss, angling for a little handout," one of the younger nurses whispered loudly to another, clearly loud enough for Dante to hear. And another person added with a sarcastic laugh, "She thinks a billionaire crime lord will fall for the damsel in distress routine. She's desperate, honestly, and pregnant to boot. What nerve?" My cheeks burned with shame, the humiliation of physical pain in my chest, and I took a small involuntary step back, preparing to disappear again, to become invisible, to just apologize and fade into the wallpaper. But I never got the chance. Dante didn't blink, didn't turn to acknowledge the snickering crowd, or even look down at the sleeve where I'd placed the note. But his entire posture changed, going from cold impatience to lethal coiled awareness, a transformation that was terrifying to witness. He strode over to the beverage station, picked up the glass that had been meant for him, a simple, clear glass, holding what looked like ordinary iced tea, and with a casual but powerful motion that belied the calculated danger, he deliberately knocked it off the counter and onto the pristine white linoleum floor. The silence that followed the crash of the glass was absolute, thick enough to choke on, and in that dead hush we all watched, horrified, as the liquid that spilled out right before it soaked into the small puddle of condensation rapidly changed color, shifting from a clear, innocuous iced tea shade to a shocking, viscous emerald green, bubbling slightly as it hit the air, leaving no doubt that it was indeed poisoned. Dante turned back, his face hard and terrifying, the lines around his eyes deepening into an expression of cold, absolute murder, and before anyone, including myself, could process the reality of the scene, the shattered glass, the sickening green puddle, the absolute cold proof of my scribbled note, he moved toward me, not with the grace of a gentleman, but with the ruthless efficiency of a force of nature. He grabbed my wrist, his grip firm and inescapable, not painful, but certainly demanding, and he dragged me without a word out of the hospital hallway, through the back corridor, and straight toward the waiting black-armored SUV, which was already idling at the emergency exit, its tinted windows dark and impenetrable, waiting like a patient, deadly beast. As he practically shoved me into the back seat, the door slamming shut with a heavy final sound that felt like the closing of a vault, my breath left me in a rush, and I finally found the ability to start sobbing, the tears flooding down my face not from physical injury, but from the sheer overwhelming terror of having just saved a life, and in doing so, destroyed my own quiet existence. The car's interior smelled of fine leather and something sharp like gun oil and power, a smell that felt completely alien and hostile to me. Dante sat beside me, his jaw clenched, the air in the car vibrating with unreleased tension, and the vehicle peeled away from the curb before I could even find the seatbelt, throwing me back into the plush leather seat. "How did you know?" he demanded, his voice low, gravelly and cutting like broken glass. The most terrifying sound I had ever heard, a sound that implied there would be no second chances. "Who sent you? Are you working for Sarah? Was this a distraction?" I just shook my head, unable to speak the words, trapped behind the sobs, struggling to form the truth that I was just a nurse, that I saw it by accident, that no one sent me, but all that came out was a garbled, terrified cry. Dante slammed his fist, not on me, but onto the seat right between us, the sound shocking and deafening in the enclosed space, making the armored car actually shudder. and he leaned in, his dark eyes boring into mine, his face inches from mine, and he spat out the cruelest, most absolute declaration I had ever heard. Nothing is an accident, nurse. People like me don't have coincidences. Tell me the truth, or this car will be the last room you ever see. It was in that moment, as the armored car sped away from the hospital, that the world decided to give me the ultimate proof of how high the stakes really were. We were only a block away, heading down the service road, the car rounding a tight corner, when the sound hit us, not a crash, not a simple bang, but a deep rolling thum that vibrated through the metal frame of the SUV, followed by a flash of orange and gray smoke billowing up into the sky behind us, chasing us like a dark, hungry cloud. I instinctively turned, pressing my hands against the bulletproof glass, and I saw it, the entire side wing of St. Jude's Hospital, where I had been standing just moments before. Where the surgery wing was now a jagged, burning ruin, black smoke pouring out of the broken windows, and a terrifyingly high column of flames licking at the afternoon sky, illuminating the chaos of fleeing people and flashing lights. The explosion wasn't an accident. It was the second half of the plan, the cleanup meant to ensure that anyone who might have seen the poisoning, anyone who might have survived Dante's death, would be instantly eliminated, destroying the evidence, and the witnesses simultaneously. And I realized with a chilling certainty that went straight to my bones that if he had taken the poison, if he had collapsed just minutes later, I would have been in that wing, crushed or burned alongside all the others. Dante was silent for a long moment, watching the fire in his rearview mirror, his face a grim mask reflecting the orange glow of the distant blaze. And then he simply adjusted his jacket, the movement so calm it was chilling, and he gave a low, harsh laugh, devoid of humor. They planned for the cleanup, he muttered more to himself than to me, the tone implying a grudging respect for the sophistication of the attack. They wanted silence and erasure. Before turning that terrifying gaze back on me, his eyes now narrowed to cold slits, he reached over and firmly gripped my wrist again, not with threat, but with the sudden, fierce realization of what I had risked. You didn't just save my life, nurse. You ruined the perfect blueprint. You interrupted the entire play. Now tell me everything. Start with your name, Ava Hart, and don't skip a single detail of the lie you just saved me from. Because if you lie to me now, you will regret saving me. The Moretti mansion was less a house and more a fortress disguised as an Italian villa, all dark marble iron gates, and an oppressive silence that screamed wealth and danger. And when we arrived, I was immediately taken inside and deposited less like a guest and more like a package of high-stakes evidence into a large cold room where Dante's security detail began, what felt less like an investigation and more like a cruel, drawn-out performance designed to break my will. The exhaustion hit me hard. I hadn't slept. I had cried, I had been nearly blown up, and I was 5 months pregnant, feeling every single minute of it. The constant mild nausea compounded by pure terror. And yet I was forced to sit in a velvet armchair surrounded by men who looked like they hadn't smiled since the Cold War, who interrogated me for hours about the note, the explosion, and most brutally about myself. They kept asking the same questions, twisting my simple answers, trying to find the lie, the motive, the hidden connection that would explain why a low-level nurse would risk everything for a man like Dante. I kept telling the same truth. I was Ava Hart, a nurse. I saw the powder. I wrote the note. I had no agenda. But the more I repeated it, the more ridiculous and feeble it sounded even to my own ears against the backdrop of this vast, terrifying empire, and their inherent belief in malice. The snickering started again, but this time it came from Dante's own men, huge, muscled men, with sharp suits, and even sharper eyes, and they weren't trying to hide it. Boss is so paranoid he brought home a pregnant nurse to interrogate. She looks like she's about to pass out from a sugar crash, one of them muttered, crossing his massive arms over his chest, his eyes filled with bored disdain, and the other a man named Enzo, whose eyes were surprisingly kind, despite his job, just looked away embarrassed for me, which somehow felt worse than the open contempt, because it acknowledged my shame. I sat there gripping the arms of the chair, trying to appear composed, while my whole body was screaming for a bed and a glass of water, trying to keep the dignity I had left. And then the wives and girlfriends of the capos, started drifting in a small, glittering parade of high-status cruelty, draped in diamonds and judgment, their perfume cloying, looking me up and down like I was a particularly unappetizing dish dragged in from the street. They didn't whisper politely. They spoke loud enough to be heard, their voices laced with acid and feigned concern, analyzing my cheap clothes and my visibly growing bump. "She's pregnant. Whose baby is it? Look at her. She thinks she can just latch onto the Moretti name and leech off the empire the way these street girls do, trading a nameless child for security," one woman said, adjusting a massive emerald ring with studied casualness, her eyes never leaving my rounded stomach. And another added, "Honestly, the audacity is staggering. Does she think the Moretti bloodline needs this? Contamination." Dante was watching all of this from the doorway, leaning against the frame, his expression unreadable. A cold, dark statue, and he didn't offer a single word in my defense. He just stood there, letting the words rain down on me, letting me feel every drop of humiliation. And in that silence, I felt completely exposed, like I was truly on trial, not just for saving his life, but for daring to exist in their world while being poor, pregnant, and utterly unremarkable. Every silent glance, every muttered judgment confirmed what I had always known, that my worth was zero in a world that valued power and status, and I was just another gold digger on trial, a burden, a complication, a weakness that needed to be promptly disposed of. The most damning thing was the guard who openly muttered, "She's a burden. Her baby will distract the boss from finding the real killer tying his hands. He needs to cut this loose." And when Dante still didn't move, still didn't stop the chorus of disdain, I felt a deep, raw ache in my chest that was worse than any physical pain, because it was the sound of my oldest fear coming true again. I was an inconvenience, and sooner or later everyone who cared about me would realize I wasn't worth the trouble. I finally managed to meet Dante's eyes, holding his gaze with a desperate, steady intensity, letting him see the quiet dignity that refused to break even under their collective weight, refusing to beg or cry, just holding the line of my truth. I finally spoke, my voice hoarse from the dry air but steady. "I did not come here for your money or your name." I said, not to the wives whose faces barely registered my existence, but directly to him, locking him into the conversation. "I came here because I am a nurse, sworn to protect life, and I could not stand by and watch a person be murdered. That is the only truth." The entire room fell silent. It was the first time I had stood up for myself in his presence, the first time I had directly challenged the narrative they were creating with a statement of pure moral motive. And in that tense silence, Dante finally pushed off the wall and walked toward me, his heavy steps echoing on the marble floor, forcing everyone to hold their breath. He ignored the gossip, the wives, and the guards, and instead he leaned down, his eyes fixed on me, demanding that I describe the poisoners again, not just their faces, but every detail, every twitch, every anomaly, pushing me to recall the moment with clinical clarity. My training took over. I closed my eyes, picturing the moment in my mind's eye, focusing with the clinical precision I used when noting a patient's subtle change in vital signs, a dropped pressure, an unusual rash, forcing my exhausted mind to retrieve the data. I recalled the oil-slick hair, the expensive but generic suit, and then the tiny, seemingly meaningless detail that had registered purely because of my habit of observational detail, a tiny, almost invisible tattoo, a single black crescent moon barely visible against the skin tucked just behind the attacker's left ear, a mark that looked more like a mole than intentional ink. It was the kind of detail most people would miss or dismiss as a private stylistic choice, something inconsequential, but as a nurse, I was trained to see what wasn't quite right, to catalog the minutiae. And when I opened my eyes and described the mark, Dante froze. He stopped completely mid-movement, his body going rigid, and a look of pure cold shock. The first real unguarded emotion I had seen on his face flickered across his eyes, before being instantly masked by a ruthless control. He immediately ordered his men to check surveillance footage from the hospital, not just the moment of the poisoning, but the entire day, every movement of every man who was near the beverage station, looking for that specific damning detail. The tense wait that followed was excruciating, stretching out for what felt like hours. while I sat there the weight of my simple truth, waiting to be confirmed or denied, hoping desperately that the camera resolution was high enough, that the angle was right, that my memory hadn't played tricks on me in the panic. When the camera operator finally brought the tablet over, Dante snatched it, his large, powerful hands navigating the screen with surprisingly swift precision, a blur of motion. He played the frame where the man leaned in, paused it right before the powder dropped, and then he zoomed in, pixel by pixel, focusing on the back of the neck, pushing the digital image past its limits, until the image was grainy but undeniable. And there it was, tiny and damning, the faint black crescent moon tattoo, exactly where I had described it, clear enough for anyone to see. Dante didn't look at the screen. He looked straight at me, his eyes now narrowed in a way that wasn't hostile but intensely analytical, realizing the depth of my honesty, the sheer improbable luck of my observation. He turned to his men, his voice low and dangerous, and he delivered the words that confirmed everything, the gravity of the name, making the entire room gasp slightly. Only Sarah Rossi's inner circle carries that specific mark. It is her signature. She's not just trying to kill me, she's trying to send a message that she controls my house. The confirmation of my truth was like a physical weight being lifted, and I finally let out a shaky breath, realizing that the sheer honesty of a seemingly random detail, my professional habit of observation, had done more to prove my worth than 1,000 desperate arguments. Dante dismissed his men with a curt wave of his hand, and when they were gone, leaving the two of us alone in the vast, silent room, he did the unthinkable. He knelt. He didn't drop to one knee like a supplicant. It was a half-kneel, a slight lowering of his massive frame that brought his face level with mine, an act of intentional, profound respect that completely obliterated the power structure of the room. Then his cold, dangerous hand, the hand that held the power of life and death, lifted and rested with unbelievable tenderness on the curve of my pregnant stomach. It was the first time a man had touched my belly with such respect, such reverence, such profound gratitude, and the sudden rush of pure, protective warmth that flooded through me was overwhelming, chasing away the cold shame. He looked not at me, but at the place where Lily was growing his expression, softening into something raw and deeply human. And he whispered his voice, stripped of its gravelly command, softer than I ever thought possible, carrying a deep, heartfelt promise. They thought you were weak, a distraction, a joke. They judged you for your burden. But you saw what all my armed guards and millions of dollars in security missed. Ava. You saved me. And because you did, you saved her too from a world that would have swallowed her whole in the aftermath. He paused, looking up at me, his gaze fierce and absolute, making me feel seen for the first time in my life. From now on, I protect both of you. You are no longer alone in this. Your sight is my shield. In that moment, the power balance of the room didn't shift. It simply ceased to matter, replaced by a deep, silent commitment that transcended all the rumors and all the humiliation. And I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that my sharp visual memory, the thing that made me a good nurse, the thing that no one valued, had just made me the most valuable person in Dante Moretti's world. The fragile peace that descended after the tattoo revelation, the period of cautious, silent acceptance, was utterly shattered when Dr. Ethan Blackwell arrived, escorted by two of Dante's men, who looked like they'd rather be escorting a load of toxic waste, looking smug and terrified, all at once, clearly believing he was here to somehow twist the narrative back in his favor, to save me, or at the very least save face. He came storming into the room, where Dante and I were having a quiet, tense discussion about the details of Sarah Rossi's movements. And he didn't even wait for an introduction. He just launched into a public, venomous character assassination, clearly trying to discredit me before I could possibly expose his dark secrets. He stood there impeccable in his expensive suit, the picture of professional authority, and in front of Dante, his capos, and a couple of the wives who had come back for the show, eager for more drama, he declared with a voice full of false sincerity and medical gravitas that I was mentally unstable and a pathological liar. You can't trust her, Moretti. She once had an abortion, a terrible secret she tried to keep from the hospital board, which led to a complete emotional spiraling into chronic depression and recklessness. She begged me for money to cover her debts, claiming hardship. She's completely unreliable and emotionally compromised, the definition of an unstable woman trying to manipulate a powerful man with a convenient pregnancy, he announced, his voice carrying the full, damaging weight of his supposed authority and medical training. The room instantly filled with the suffocating silence of judgment. Everyone looked at me like I was exactly what they suspected: trash, a desperate liar trying to use a pregnancy as a shield, and the shame, the raw, cutting injustice of his words hit me with such force that I couldn't even manage to look away from his sickeningly self-satisfied face. The worst part was that the lies were so calculated, so rooted in a distorted, weaponized version of the truth that I couldn't immediately unravel them in front of this hostile crowd. He was using real events and twisting the motives, making me look like a desperate, weak woman. The anonymous messages, clearly orchestrated by Ethan and spread by Sarah's network, to sow deeper discord, began to flood Dante's encrypted channels, reinforcing the false narrative. I watched as one of his aides showed him a screen filled with ugly, baseless accusations disguised as insider information. The baby isn't her ex's. She was running with a bad crowd before nursing, selling secrets. Probably one of her clients at the old clinic who was paying her off to keep quiet about something illicit. Every single word was a direct stab, leveraging my vulnerable situation and my humble background to paint me as the worst kind of manipulator, a spy, and a whore. The Mafia wives, now completely validated in their initial assessment, whispered louder, preening in their self-righteousness, their eyes flashing with malicious pleasure. And Sarah, via a chillingly calm video message that suddenly appeared on a nearby screen, actually tried to convince Dante that I was an undercover spy, a honey trap sent to infiltrate the Moretti family and kill him slowly from the inside out, poisoning him with my instability. I felt the collective weight of their disdain pressing down on me, the atmosphere turning toxic and suffocating. And suddenly 2 of Dante's security men, acting on his silent nod, stepped forward and tied my hands and ankles to the heavy chair, with silk cord gently but firmly transforming the velvet armchair into an interrogation piece, a visible symbol of my suspected guilt. Dante walked around me slowly, his hands clasped behind his back, his face a complete, terrifying blank, watching silently as I sat there tied and helpless, while Ethan continued to spin his web of lies, and I truly felt like my life was over, that all my quiet dignity was about to be shredded in front of the most dangerous man in the city. I focused on a tiny spot on the floor, breathing slowly, trying to regulate my panicked heart rate for Lily's sake, refusing to cry or beg, refusing to give Ethan the satisfaction of seeing me break, maintaining a stiff, silent resistance that was the only weapon I had left against his endless monologue of slander. I could only wait for Dante's judgment, which felt like an eternity. Finally, Dante moved, grabbing the tablet that Marco had been holding, the one displaying Ethan's accusations and the anonymous messages, and smashing it against the marble floor with such devastating force that the sharp crack cutting through the monologue of lies sounded like a guillotine. He didn't shout. He just ordered his head of security, Marco, to immediately conduct an aggressive deep dive investigation into Ava Hart, with a special focus on Dr. Ethan Blackwell, giving him just 1 hour to find the truth, the absolute verifiable truth, or he would deal with both of them himself. The tension in the room ratcheted up so high it was almost unbearable, and I watched my heart in my throat as Marco, a man who looked like he could snap Ethan in half without blinking, left, with a grim, determined look on his face, promising to uncover every dirty secret. When Marco returned exactly 57 minutes later, the air in the room changed again, shifting from toxic judgment to a stunned, horrified silence as he presented his findings to Dante, reading them out loud from a crisp report, his voice flat and dispassionate, laying bare the extent of the betrayal. Marco stated clearly that Ava had never had an abortion. Years ago, she had been the nurse on duty when an abandoned newborn, sickly and frail, suffering from severe withdrawal, was brought in, and she had fought tooth and nail, risking her career to save the baby's life, even paying for specialized formula herself, when the hospital refused to approve the expense. But the hospital, fearing a massive PR scandal, had forced her to sign an NDA and keep her heroism silent, threatening her license. Furthermore, the supposed depression that Ethan had so casually mocked was actually a prolonged period where I was exhibiting severe symptoms of drug-induced fatigue, memory lapses, and disorientation, which Marco's team confirmed was caused by a slow-acting CNS depressant, a sedative prescribed and subtly administered to me by none other than Dr. Ethan Blackwell himself, over a period of months, designed to keep me docile, quiet, and compliant enough for him to carry out his real crime: the systematic embezzlement of the hospital endowment funds and the siphoning of patient donations. The money begging he accused me of was simply a distraction, a projection he was the one who had stolen millions, and was now trying to frame me to keep me quiet about the minor irregularities I had noticed in the accounting when I volunteered for the charity wing. The final part of the report detailed Ethan's recent panic, showing that he was desperate to marry into a wealthy family to cover his tracks, and that my sudden appearance as a witness to Dante's poisoning had terrified him, leading him to launch this vicious preemptive campaign to discredit me before I could accidentally expose his financial crimes to the powerful Moretti family, whom he was currently trying to court for favors and investment. The revelation hung in the air, damning and absolute. And for the first time, Dr. Ethan Blackwell's perfect smirking facade finally broke, dissolving into a look of sheer cold panic as he realized the full terrifying implications of his failed scheme and his now imminent destruction. Dante didn't look at Ethan. He looked at the glass wall of the room, a massive custom-made divider separating the office from the dining area, a sheet of supposedly shatterproof structural glass, and with a guttural, terrifying roar of pure, unleashed rage that seemed to come from a well of deep old sorrow. He punched it not once but twice, shattering the thick, seemingly unbreakable glass into a spiderweb of cracks, the sound echoing through the mansion like a gunshot, scattering his men back several paces, everyone stunned by the raw, visceral display of force. His anger wasn't aimed at me, or even at Ethan, who was now weeping silently in terror, but at the injustice, at the sheer cold-blooded cruelty of a man who would systematically drug and destroy an innocent, heroic life to cover his own petty, greedy crimes, a reflection of the systemic betrayal Dante himself had witnessed years ago. I watched stunned as his composure completely evaporated, replaced by a raw, volcanic fury that was far more terrifying than his usual icy control. He walked back to me, his knuckles bleeding onto the pristine silk ropes that held me, not caring about the blood, and he immediately cut me free with a switchblade, his hands moving quickly and gently, his own blood now staining my pale cotton shirt in a silent, unplanned bond. He faced the assembled room, his voice a low, vibrating menace that commanded absolute terrified attention, addressing the capo wives directly. The child in her womb is innocent, conceived in honesty, and protected by courage, and the mother is a woman of integrity, he declared, his voice shaking with restrained power, his eyes sweeping over every single person who had just judged me, lingering on the horrified faces of the capo wives. And from this day forward, he finished, his voice returning to its granite hardness. She is not alone. Any person who dares to mention her past or try to smear her name again to question her honesty or her worth will answer only to me. Consider the investigation complete. The silence that followed was total, and I knew in that moment, watching the terrifying honesty of his rage, that Dante was correcting the mistake he had made when he lost his poisoned wife. The mistake of believing the subtle, creeping lies until it was too late. And now he was not going to make that mistake with me. He had chosen to trust the silent truth over the convenient lie. The next few weeks were a strange, unsettling blur, a period of uncomfortable, cautious acceptance in the Moretti mansion, where the air was thick with unspoken resentment and fear, a place where I was now a protected artifact, but certainly not a welcome one, not yet. Ethan Blackwell, having been exposed as a despicable fraud, a drugger and a thief, had disappeared completely. His medical license instantly revoked, his reputation ruined, and his attempt to marry into wealth to cover his embezzlement was immediately and publicly cancelled by his horrified fiancé's family, leaving him disgraced and penniless. A pathetic example of the world correcting its own injustice without me having to lift a finger. A silent, satisfying consequence. But Sarah Rossi, she was a predator, an apex rival, and she saw the blood oath not as a deterrent, but as a challenge, a declaration of war over a new, unexpected territory, Dante's heart. Her relentless propaganda continued the rumors, shifting from questioning my morals to questioning my judgment, and more importantly, Dante's sanity, claiming that I was too weak, too ordinary, and too fragile to survive in his world, let alone be the protector of his secret. Moretti is going to die because of a plain nurse, the headlines whispered in the dark corners of the web, fueled by Serra's insidious network, her PR machine working overtime to undermine Dante's authority. The sheer volume of the scorn was overwhelming, turning me into a national symbol of dangerous, naive weakness, the soft spot in the Moretti armor. Serra, ever the master of the psychological attack, had the audacity to send a tailored message to Dante, openly taunting him via encrypted channels. A mafia boss in love with a pregnant woman, pathetic. You've lost your edge, Dante. She is your weakness and everyone knows it. I will exploit it. The internal pressure was even worse, a constant low-level thrum of anxiety that centered around me. I would overhear Dante's capos, his trusted, deadly lieutenants, murmuring among themselves, their voices low and grim as they discussed strategy. They weren't plotting against him, but they were genuinely worried, their loyalty battling with their sense of self-preservation and the family's stability. Boss has lost his edge, one of them? A massive man named Sal whispered one evening as I passed the billiards room, not seeing me immediately. He's protecting a child that isn't even his, risking the family for a woman he met in a hospital hallway. The entire structure is unstable because of her. She'll drag him to his grave, mark my words, and we'll all go with him. Hearing that, hearing the fear that I, of a heart, was the Achilles heel that would finally bring down a king and plunge the city into war, that I was responsible for the risk to hundreds of lives, was devastating. It wasn't just their judgment I felt. It was the echo of my own deepest trauma, the fear that once again I would be the reason someone I cared about, someone I was beginning to rely on, would suffer catastrophic harm. The burden of being the potential cause of Dante's downfall became unbearable, heavier than the child I was carrying, and the old familiar desperate instinct to run, to disappear, to protect the person I loved by removing myself from their life and taking my problem with me returned violently. I decided I had to leave, not to hurt him, but because I truly believed it was the only way to save him, to give him back his strength and his empire before I became the target that brought the whole structure down around us. I planned my escape, meticulously leveraging the quiet hours of the night when the mansion was relatively still. The guards tired and bored, knowing that I couldn't simply walk out, because Dante had doubled the security perimeter and installed cameras everywhere. I packed only what I needed, my few savings, my ID, and a small bag of essentials for Lily, leaving behind every single luxurious thing he had given me, every dress, every expensive piece of jewelry, because I wanted him to know beyond a shadow of a doubt that I was not a gold digger, that my motives were pure, based only on protection. The hardest part was writing the note, a simple, painful sentence scratched on the back of an envelope. I can't be your weakness. Forgive me for choosing to protect you. I was halfway down the grand staircase, my shoes in my hand, padding silently on the marble, my heart pounding a panicked rhythm against my ribs, convinced I was doing the right thing, when I heard his voice, sharp and commanding, cutting through the silence of the night, echoing from the shadows of the study. Stop right there, Ava. I froze, knowing there was no point in running, that his awareness was faster than my feet, and I slowly turned to face him, standing alone in the massive foyer, wearing a dark silk robe, his face etched with a look of intense, cold betrayal and profound disappointment. He didn't ask. He simply stated the obvious, the pain clear in his voice. You were leaving. Because you heard the whispers, didn't you? You believe you're a liability, an anchor that will sink me just like they say. I didn't answer. I simply adjusted the strap of my old canvas bag, a tiny defiant gesture of my independence and my resolve, and met his eyes, my quiet strength now completely exposed, raw and vulnerable. He didn't yell or threaten or even try to stop me physically. Instead, he walked toward me, his movements slow and deliberate, and he took my hand, his touch warm and electric, pulling me back towards the center of the foyer, closing the distance I was trying to create. You think you are saving me by running away? Ava. That is the mistake of a nurse making a clinical calculation based on incomplete data. You don't understand how this world works. My weakness is not what they see a pregnant woman. My weakness is the hole they leave when they take what I love, the silence they create when they destroy my future. He paused, looking down at our joined hands, his thumb tracing the swollen veins on the back of mine, reminding me of the life we shared. Then, without any explanation, he ushered me quickly toward the waiting vehicle which had mysteriously appeared at the side entrance already warmed up, and he looked me straight in the eye, his expression stern and unyielding. I refuse to let you make a choice based on fear and on the lies of my enemies. You will come with me. Now. You need to see this to understand who you are now, the status you carry, and what your presence truly means to everyone. Despite my protests, my soft attempts to pull away and argue that this wasn't his decision to make, that he couldn't force me to stay, he was relentless, his grip firm, and he simply lifted my heavy pregnant body into the passenger seat, strapping me in before I could register the absurdity of the situation, a pregnant nurse being dragged to an unknown destination by a mafia boss, all because she tried to walk away to protect him. The destination was a massive, dimly lit ballroom in the city's oldest, most imposing hotel, a place steeped in the old history of power and corruption. And as Dante pulled me through the heavy oak doors, despite my nervous resistance, the air inside felt instantly thick with power, cigar smoke, and unspoken history. I realized with a wave of sickening dread that I was in the middle of a global mafia meeting, a gathering of the most powerful and ruthless individuals in the underworld, the room packed with men whose names were synonymous with organized crime, all of them silent and watching as Dante Moretti, the cold, untouchable enigma, walked in, holding the hand of a very pregnant, visibly terrified young woman, his face covered in a fierce resolve. The silence was absolute, a heavy, suffocating blanket of judgment and curiosity that was worse than any noise. Dante led me straight to the center of the room, to the head of the massive mahogany table, where the most powerful capos and lords were seated, their faces hard and unmoving, including, to my utter horror, Sarah Rossi, who was sitting there with a sleek, predatory smile that didn't reach her cold eyes, her presence radiating a lethal calm authority, a silver-dressed serpent among the dark suits. She looked me up and down, that same look of dismissive, condescending judgment that the wives had given me, only amplified 1,000 times, and her smile widened, a silent, cutting taunt, aimed directly at Dante, challenging his judgment and his sanity. Dante ignored her, ignored the whispers, and ignored my trembling hand. He faced the entire assembly, a silent army of hardened criminals, men who lived and died by reputation and tradition, and in a move that I never could have anticipated, a move that went against every modern rule of their cold, calculated world. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a short, wicked-looking knife, a ceremonial-looking dagger, and without a single flicker of hesitation or pain, he stabbed the point straight into his own palm, drawing blood. The shock in the room was palpable. Everyone gasped, leaning forward, their eyes wide, unsure what they were witnessing. Was this a suicide attempt? A display of madness. Dante let the blood drip slowly, deliberately onto the polished mahogany table, a dark, viscous pool that instantly commanded every single eye in the room, and he spoke, his voice ringing with a conviction and power that surpassed even the silence and oath that was centuries old, a language of absolute binding commitment. My blood protects her, he stated, his voice a low, gravelly vow, his eyes hard and absolute, sweeping over every face in the room, pausing briefly on Sarah's shocked expression, which finally broke her composure. Anyone who touches her, anyone who so much as speaks her name with disrespect, who questions her status or her right to be here, touches me, and will face the collective wrath of the Moretti family immediately, and without appeal. The line is drawn now. He then took his bloodied hand, the hand that had just been wounded in a silent act of devastating commitment, and placed it gently, carefully on the swell of my belly, right where Lily lay nestled, and he finished his declaration with a fierce, quiet certainty that shook the entire room to its core. And this child is Moretti family. No test needed. She is the future. and so is her mother. The mother is the queen. The entire underworld was shaken. No mafia boss had ever sworn loyalty, let alone a public blood oath of this magnitude, to a pregnant woman with no blood ties, no name, and no status. And in that moment, Dante traded his reputation, his pride, and his own blood for my safety, making me the humble pregnant nurse utterly untouchable. An extension of his own power, and the sheer audacity of his love left me completely speechless, overwhelmed by the depth of his unwavering trust and the terrifying consequence of his commitment. The blood oath worked, of course, for a time. No one dared to touch me, and the consequences for Ethan Blackwell, who was now exposed as a despicable fraud, a drugger and a thief in the public eye, were swift and absolute. His license was revoked, his reputation was ruined, and his attempt to marry into wealth to cover his embezzlement was immediately and publicly cancelled by his horrified fiancé's family, who took pains to distance themselves from his scandal. He was left disgraced, penniless, and professionally destroyed, a pathetic example of the world, correcting its own injustice without me having to lift a finger, a natural and satisfying consequence. But Sarah Rossi, she was a predator, cunning and patient, and she saw the blood oath not as a deterrent, but as a challenge, a clear map to Dante's heart, which was now undeniably tethered to me. She knew exactly where to strike. She knew that Dante's strength was his weakness, that the only thing that would truly shatter his ice-cold composure was to target what he loved most, what he had sworn to protect with his life. And since she couldn't touch me without starting a war that would consume her, she went for the only thing that would make me and Dante break completely our unborn child. She was banking on the fact that I was still an ordinary woman, prone to ordinary fear and maternal instinct. It happened 2 months later, right when I was nearing the end of my pregnancy, when I was at my most physically vulnerable and emotionally overwhelmed, spending a quiet afternoon in the library of the mansion, reading an old medical textbook, completely convinced that the blood oath meant I was safe, a mistake born of trusting a sacred tradition in a lawless world. I didn't hear them enter. They were professionals' shadows in the midday light, silent and deadly. And 1 minute I was flipping a page, feeling a soft kick from Lily, and the next a heavy dark sack was pulled over my head, smelling faintly of cheap burlap and concrete dust, and I felt 2 pairs of strong hands grabbing me, hoisting my heavy pregnant body up and carrying me away with brutal, practiced efficiency. The sheer terror of being unable to see, of being jostled and moved without knowing where I was going, made me panic, and the sudden, sharp, twisting pain in my stomach was instantaneous. A terrifying contraction that made me cry out, not just from the pain of the abduction, but from the primal fear for Lily, a fear that was worse than the thought of my own death. When the sack was finally ripped off my head, I gasped, blinking in the dim light, and I was in a massive cold concrete warehouse tied to a chair with thick ropes that dug painfully into my wrists and ankles, and there she was, Sarah Rossi, impeccably dressed in a sharp silver suit, standing before me with that sickeningly calm smile, looking like a cat playing with a captured bird, savoring the moment. "Hello, Nurse Hart," she purred, her voice low and chilling, enjoying my distress. "Did you really think a few drops of blood on a table could stop me? You are still just an ordinary woman, Ava, with the most ordinary of vulnerabilities, and I know exactly what ordinary women value." She walked toward me slowly, deliberately, her high, expensive heel clicking ominously on the concrete floor, the sound echoing in the vast, empty space. And then she did the one thing that truly broke me. She knelt down, not like Dante had, with reverence, but with sickening, possessive cruelty, and she stroked my belly, her hand cold against the fabric of my dress, tracing the outline of my unborn daughter. "If Moretti wants you so badly, if he's willing to sacrifice his honor and his empire for you," she whispered, her eyes alight with maniacal glee, "I'll take what he values most, the baby. A child is chaos, Ava, and the stress of a sudden delivery is often fatal for the weakest element." The pain in my stomach intensified, a relentless, gripping contraction that made my whole body shake, a clear sign that the physical trauma of the kidnapping was starting the labor process. And I realized, with a terrifying certainty, that she was deliberately trying to induce labor to hurt Lily, and I screamed a raw animal sound of pure helpless maternal terror that I didn't even know I was capable of making. She forced a phone into my hand, shoving it against my ear, its cold surface a stark contrast to my fevered skin, and through my sobs and the agonizing sharp pain she forced me to record a goodbye video, a final heartbreaking message to Dante, one designed to cut him to the quick. I could barely speak, my voice ragged with pain and fear, the words coming out in choked gasps. But I managed to choke out the words, believing they were my last, and that he would choose his crown over me, that I had failed him by becoming this target. Dante, they have me. They're hurting Lily. The contractions are starting. I love you. Please don't come. Don't risk everything for me. Will you choose me or the Empire? You have to choose the future of the family. The last line was the hardest, the cruelest demand, because deep down I still feared that the whispers were true, that he was a king, and kings always choose their kingdom over a single quiet queen. Sarah snatched the phone away, satisfied, her face triumphant. And the pain became a constant tearing agony, a clear sign that Lily was in imminent danger, and I closed my eyes, praying for a miracle that I knew would never come, utterly convinced that my choice to stay had indeed brought ruin and death to the only two people who truly mattered to me. I was preparing myself for the end, the cruel, agonizing end, when the doors of the warehouse suddenly burst open, with a deafening crash ripped off their hinges, as if hit by a freight train, and in the doorway, framed by the chaos and the dust, stood Dante. He was alone. No army, no backup, no entourage, just him, a solitary, terrifying figure radiating an intensity that was more devastating than 1,000 armed men. His dark suit, dusty, his eyes, cold fire, the picture of absolute, terrifying focus. He had chosen me completely, utterly, without a second thought, trading his life for ours, trading the entire Moretti future for the present moment. And he walked through the warehouse toward us, ignoring the panicked shouts of Sarah's men, moving with a singular, frightening purpose like a Terminator. Sarah, realizing the extent of his commitment, that he valued me more than his own life, screamed an order, and her men opened fire. The sound of the gunfire was deafening, echoing off the concrete walls, and I watched horrified as Dante was hit once in the shoulder, twice in the torso, 3 times his body, staggering the force of the bullets, making him spin, but he didn't fall. He kept moving, crawling when he couldn't walk, staggering through the hail of bullets, his eyes never leaving mine, his entire focus fixed only on reaching me, his blood leaving a dark trail on the cold floor, proving in the most painful, undeniable way possible that his empire was nothing compared to the promise he had made. He finally reached me, his body slumping against the chair, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps, his face pale, and with the last of his strength, he reached up and fumbled with the ropes, his bloodied hands struggling to untie the knots, his teeth gritted against the pain, his focus absolute. I was in agony, the pain from the contractions now constant, and as I saw the light fading in his eyes, the absolute terror of losing him snapped my medical training back into focus, replacing the fear with cold clinical determination. He finally managed to loosen the ropes on my hands, freeing one of them, just as Sarah, enraged by his refusal to die, stepped closer, raising her own gun for a clean final shot, a cruel smirk of victory on her face. I acted purely on instinct. With a strength born of sheer survival and the terrifying power of motherhood, the power to defend my unborn child, I snatched the discarded sidearm from one of the neutralized guards near the chair, aimed with the steady hand of a woman who had spent years making fine, precise cuts during medical procedures, and without hesitation, I squeezed the trigger, shooting Sarah Rossi dead, the sharp crack of the gunshot, silencing the room, ending the threat, and saving my entire world in one devastating second, proving that the quiet ones are the ones you should fear the most. The immediate aftermath was a blur of police sirens, screaming men, and frantic activity, but all I remember is Dante collapsing fully into my lap, his arms wrapping around my waist, pulling my heavy body close, and I held him, pressing my face into his neck, the scent of gunpowder and blood replacing the antiseptic chill of the hospital. I was still in pain, but the immediate threat was gone, replaced by a profound, agonizing relief. And he looked up at me, his eyes clouded with pain, but filled with a love that was absolute and true. He reached up, touching my cheek with his thumb, wiping away my tears, And then his hand slipped down, resting on the side of my bump, right where Lily was waiting, and he whispered the words, ragged and raw, against my stomach, repeating the promise he had made months ago, now sealed in gunfire and blood. From now on, Ava, you and the baby are my family, my only choice, my only empire. We walk this road together forever. He was patched up, of course, tough as granite, and Lily was born perfectly healthy just a few weeks later, a small, furious miracle that changed everything. The story naturally became legend, and I became something I never asked to be the nurse queen. I wasn't feared for taking lives, but honored for saving them, both Dante's and Lily's, and for being the only person who stood firm when the entire world tried to shout me down, the one who saw the small, crucial details and acted on them. I found my place in the quiet, deadly heart of a dangerous world, not by becoming ruthless or cold, but by remaining exactly who I was, honest, underestimated, and possessed of a quiet, unshakable strength. I walk with dignity now, not because of the name I bear, but because of the truth I held, the courage I found, and the love that saved us all. And now I look at you, and I see the echoes of that fear, that feeling of being unseen. You were never small. You were just waiting for your moment to prove it. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.